The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Andrzej Duda, President of the Republic of Poland. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Andrzej Duda, President of the Republic of Poland, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Wielce Szanowny
Honorable Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellency, distinguished Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished heads of states, nations, and governments, esteemed delegates, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. 1 year ago, I was delivering my speech at this very place as a president of a country of 38 million people. Today, I'm standing on this rostrum with the awareness that in my country, in Poland, according to various statistics, more than 40, and according to some voices, as many as 41 million people are living. The additional 2 or 3 million people are first and foremost refugees from Ukraine, our neighbors. Some of them are our permanent guests, while others travel between Poland and Ukraine. However, there is one thing that all of them have in common. They are sheltering in our country from war. They are taking refuge in our country from death, from slavery in the Russian occupation after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war has been going on for as long as 7 months, the war provoked by Russian aggression. Is the war in which Russia is not limiting itself just to fighting the Ukrainian army. The Russian troops are killing civilians. They are forcibly relocating them to their territory. Russia is destroying Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian monuments, schools, kindergartens, and hospitals. It destroys agricultural crops. It devastates the natural environment in Ukraine. It is destroying literally everything it cannot seize or loot. Recently, it is threatening not only Ukraine, but the entire world, first and foremost Europe, with a nuclear catastrophe. Through attacking, through invoking failure of the nuclear power plants, mainly the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The decision to wage this horrible war was made in Russia by people prompted by imperial sentiment and colonial nationalist Russian hubris, exalting their own people and denying the right to self-determination to their sovereign neighbors. They managed to obsess with this thought the nation of one of the UN's founding states, a nation that had a chance to protest against the insanity of its leaders. Unfortunately, only a few among the Russians, those most courageous, stood up against this war. They dared to stand on the side of justice and honesty. Honorable Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, this war, the war started by Russia and Ukraine, like all other conflicts going on in the world today, must be lost by the aggressor. And this aggressor in this very case is, let me reiterate it once again, the Russian state. More than that, the aggressor, in a sense, has already lost. It has lost because it failed to subdue every nation. It lost because it did not break the spirit of the Ukrainian nation. It lost because it did not disperse the Ukrainian army. Today it has against it not only the Ukrainian state itself, but a nation of many millions, the vast majority of whom do not want any negotiations whatsoever with the invader until he withdraws his forces from the occupied lands of Ukraine. It is at odds with a large part of the nations of the world who have spoken their minds very clearly, also in the resolutions adopted here in the United Nations organization. It has against itself my country, Poland, whom, and I'm saying this here and now, Ukraine can always count on. Ladies and gentlemen, I was one of those politicians who, even before the war, believed that Ukraine would successfully defend itself. Today, I am convinced that Ukraine will prevail, that the refugees will return to their homes, that Ukraine will be rebuilt, that its internationally recognized borders will be restored. My country, Poland, joining forces with its allies, will do its utmost to make this happen. But there are also other facets to this war. It has economic repercussions in many areas. A parallel war unleashed by Russia, the war against our common principles and values, against all of humanity. And I also want to talk about it today because I can see in this hall many representatives of familiar countries from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, with whose leaders I spoke just before the war or during the war. This is not a regional conflict. This war, the war of Russia against Ukraine, is a stoke of global fire. This war will bear on our and your countries unless it has already happened. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, one of the most dramatic effects, the global effects of the Russian aggression, is the food crisis and the specter of famine looming over large parts of the world. I have had lengthy discussions on the subject during my recent journey to countries of West Africa, Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal. In all those countries, I have spoken with their leaders about food security and potential impacts of further restrictions on exports of grain and fertilizers from Ukraine and Russia. The topic featured also in previous discussions we had together with fellow presidents from Central and Eastern Europe, with leaders from Africa, from the Middle East, and Asia. I also vividly recall a conversation I had with UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, which we had late at night in Rzeszów, when Mr. Secretary General was on his way to Ukraine to discuss and to address food-related problems. Thank you, sir, for your zeal, for your commitment, for your resolve, and the courage that Secretary General had, which was and is so much needed in this difficult time in order to represent the international community gathered in this largest organization in the world with dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, from the very beginning of the invasion, Russia has been deliberately and cynically destroying new crops and farming equipment, and the invasion itself has drastically reduced Ukrainian harvests. The data we have obtained makes it clear. Russia has seized farmland representing 22% of all agricultural land in Ukraine. 1/5 of the land that is the breadbasket of many non-European countries, the land which produces nearly 30% of winter crops, has failed to produce any crops suddenly this season, or its harvest has been looted. Speaking in this fold, I do not need to recall that Ukraine is one of the most important food producers in the world. It is a breadbasket not only of Europe but also of the world. Conservative estimates indicate that this year alone, Ukraine's harvest will be 35% smaller in the aftermath of war. I emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, 35% smaller harvest in Ukraine. More than 1/3 of the breadbasket of large parts of the world has been eliminated by the Russian aggression. Who will suffer from this? Those who are most in need. It is an economic weapon. It is weaponization of food, hitting the hardest Africa and the Middle East. I have been in politics long enough not to be naive on that count. This is a deliberate policy of Russia. It is estimated that in the aftermath of war in Ukraine, the number of people suffering from chronic hunger this year will increase by about 47 million people. Again, especially in Africa and in the Middle East. There, this famine catastrophe provoked by Russia as a result of its aggression of Ukraine will be most visible. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as an international community, we are obliged to prevent anyone in the 21st century from knowingly and cynically causing artificial famine in the name of achieving their political goals, the way Stalin did back in the 1930s. In this context, it is of key importance that on July the 22nd in Istanbul, Russia and Ukraine signed agreements with Turkey and the UN. Those documents are aimed at unblocking sea route through the Black Sea for the export of millions of tons of Ukrainian grain. Once again, I would like to personally acknowledge the significant role played by the United Nations Secretary-General in the conclusion of this accord of Mr. Antonio Guterres. This is a great success of the United Nations organization and of Secretary-General in this extremely difficult situation. Now, we all have to guard the parties' compliance with the agreements and their commitments. I am all the more concerned by the ever more frequent statements from the Russian side undermining the accord, as well as by acts deserving to be condemned in the strongest terms, such as the shelling of the Odessa seaport by the Russian army, which occurred less than 24 hours of the signing of the documents. As an international community, we must immediately respond to such incidents by imposing further sanctions and providing more aid packages to Ukraine, which is defending itself. For my part, I would like to assure you that Poland, together with its European Union partners, as a neighbor of Ukraine, remains steadfastly committed to facilitating Ukrainian grain exports also by land. We will go to great lengths to make sure that those consignments reach those who are most in need, especially in Africa, Asia, South America, and everywhere where it is needed so that people can survive. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable delegates, in the face of Russia's unlawful actions, we should learn a lesson for the future. We should also keep in mind the provisions of international law and the possibility of holding perpetrators accountable. A number of regulations exist in international law on the protection of food resources and the natural environment during conflicts. Among others, one can cite the provisions of Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which recognizes the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger, and in which states pledged to distribute the world's food supplies equitably. In addition, Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts from 1977 in Article 54 prohibits, among other things, attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs and agricultural zones. In turn, Article 55 of the Protocol obliges states to protect the natural environment from damage during hostilities. That Russia is deliberately destroying Ukraine's agriculture in breach of international law is probably no great surprise to anyone here. But in the face of a barbaric war, are international legal regulations a sufficient response to the enormity of the damage to the environment and the world's food supply? I have strong doubts about this. It is in this context that I see the need to develop penalization mechanisms to be able in the future to bring to justice the persons responsible for violating international law. Those who knowingly destroy crops in the breadbasket of the world must know that they will be pursued to be prosecuted as long as they live. I would like from this place to support all existing and new initiatives so that those who deprive millions of people of their right to food and destroy the environment will no longer go unpunished. Poland wants to actively participate in their work. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable delegates, the Russian aggression on Ukraine constitutes no less than an aggression against the whole world, Each aggression requires a multidimensional international response with determination and without hesitation. It is necessary to step up the pressure on Russia and its accomplice, Alexander Lukashenko's regime in Belarus. Advisability of continuing cooperation with those governments should be deeply reassessed, also by international organizations. There is no more room for business as usual with Russia. The times of business as usual have definitely come to an end, and that was finished by Russia through its bestial aggression against Ukraine, through violating the principles of international law, through lack of respect for man and for human life. I say this as a man who, on the 23rd of February, visited Kiev in Ukraine, and who then, since the beginning of the war, right after Russian aggression, has been to Ukraine 3 times. Who has been to Ukraine and who has seen the damage to Borodianka near Kiev, who has been there and has seen the destroyed houses in Irpin, who has been there and saw the suffering of the civilian population in Ukraine, who has been to Ukraine and has seen the repercussions of the Russian brutal aggression, blood on the streets, those where the Russian soldiers were shooting families, driving in passenger cars, fleeing from the war. It is hard to imagine that, but distinguished delegates, I have seen that with my own eyes. I have seen the enormity of that bestiality, and I know what Russian aggression in Ukraine means, and what it means when President Volodymyr Zelensky says about Russian brutality and death of thousands of Ukrainians murdered by the Russians. And I'm saying this here today in front of you during the General Assembly of the United Nations as a leader of a state whose borders were crossed by almost 6 million Ukrainian refugees since the start of the Russian aggression. Our children go to schools together with Ukrainian children today. Those Ukrainians who have come to us saving their lives, fleeing. Our citizens have taken to their homes hundreds of thousands of refugees. Yes. Perhaps it's hard to believe it for many of you, but despite the fact that 6 million Ukrainian refugees have come to our country, and according to our estimates, around 2 million are staying in Poland right now, despite of all of that, we did not have to build a single refugee camp. There was no such necessity. Nobody is living in a tent in Poland. Everybody has found a dignified accommodation in dignified conditions in homes and in places specially prepared for them, in hotels, in boarding houses, in other temporary locations. There are no tent camps in Poland where people would be living, sheltering themselves from war. Everybody has found dignified accommodation. Every Polish man and every Polish woman is familiar with the situation in Ukraine. Every Polish man and every Polish woman vividly remembers what Russian occupation means, what Russian invasion on a state means, what Russian terror means, because Polish families have lived through that terror after the Second World War, when the Russians occupied Poland, and when Poland was behind the Iron Curtain and the patriots were trying to shake off the Russian yoke, and they were fighting, and many people were put in prisons and murdered. In 1939, right after the invasion of Nazi Germany on Poland, the country which, together with Nazi Germany, with the Nazi state, invaded the Republic of Poland and destroyed my country, was precisely the Soviet Russia, on the basis of a Hitler-Stalin pact, which was entered into on the 23rd of August, 1939. The Soviet Russia occupied 50% of my country, and close to 2 million people back then were deported to the Far East, to the depths of Siberia. 22,000 Polish officers and policemen were brutally murdered by the Soviets. They were shot down in Katyn, in Miednoje, in Kharkiv, and in Tver. We know what Russian terror means, what Russian occupation means. That is why Poles went to help Ukrainian refugees without asking any questions. Neither the government nor myself, the president of Poland, had to call to them to do that. We didn't have to appeal to them. People spontaneously went to the border in order to help and to take the Ukrainians fleeing the Russian aggression, to take them to their homes. This is our reality, the reality of Central Europe. Mr. President, most distinguished members of the delegations, we must not forget those who are suffering. Let us remember that 6 months of Russian aggression in Ukraine has brought the biggest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. I appeal for an increase in aid to the Ukrainian civilian population, whose humanitarian needs are far greater than the funds currently being provided. Winter is approaching, which, aggravated by the war and energy prices, will be the hardest winter in years. As humanity, we have no right to turn our backs on those most in need. The international community mustn't show any war fatigue. We have to help. We have to support. We should work together on such a roadmap for economic and social development to give people hope that the world can be a better and more supportive place to live. In spite of being so scarred today by wars, by the effects of pandemics and natural disasters, Poland wants to co-create such a program, including here at the UN Forum, for example, as part of the work of the Economic and Social Council. Ladies and gentlemen, still I owe a few words of truth to us, the leaders of the rich North, or as others might like to put it, of the West. Also, the West of Europe. It is very positive that we have risen to the challenge, on the issue of Ukraine, that we have preserved our unity and rallied to support the victim and not the aggressor, that Western Europe today can clearly say the difference, who attacked whom. They know that Russia is the aggressor and that Ukraine is suffering. It is positive that there is a clear distinction on this. But let's not become complacent. My recent visit to Africa made me even more aware of something I had previously thought about for a long time myself. Were we equally resolute during the tragedies of Syria, Libya, or Yemen? Did we not return to business as usual over the tragedies of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the wars in the Horn of Africa? And while condemning the invasion of Ukraine, do we give equal weight to fighting mercenaries who seek to destabilize the Sahel and threaten many other states in Africa? I think that the lesson learned from this war is as follows. If the United Nations is truly to be united, then every response to violations of international law should be identical, decisive, and principled. Because the world is a system of communicating vessels. Today, the victim is Ukraine. But if Russian imperialism succeeds, then tomorrow it could be any country in the world. And someone else will plunder the fields to someone else. They will turn civilians out of doors and murder them. We must not allow this to happen. Poland's position in the face of any war is clear and unambiguous. We demand absolute respect for internationally recognized borders. The inviolability of these borders is the fundamental element of the global order, and this is the precondition for peace in every single case. Today, Ukraine is the victim. Tomorrow, any one of us can be the victim unless we respect those ironclad rules, unless we do not force that the international law is respected. And there is no hiding it. Russia owes Ukraine war reparations, which it will have to pay. There is no justice without reparations. This applies to any country plundering another country. It applies today, but it also applies to unsettled issues from the past. I say this as the Polish president, the president of Poland, who was so horrifically experienced by the Second World War, which was ruined and destroyed in a large part, which lost 6 million citizens, including 3 million Polish citizens of Jewish origin, of Jewish nationality. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why Poland shall not cease its efforts aimed at holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law, both at the state level as well as on the individual one. This war has to be resolved in such a way that the aggressor will pay for the losses and damages caused. It will pay for every murdered human being in Ukraine. It will pay for every ruined house, for every destroyed school building, plant, and hospital. This is necessary. Let us use all our powers and capabilities to ensure that the culprits are tried and punished. We are already cooperating with the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice to find the most effective ways to identify and prosecute the perpetrators. Distinguished Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, on many occasions in its history has the free world been faced with partition wars caused by enemies of freedom, possessed by sick ambitions or the desire for total domination. From the genociders of the most ancient times to Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Pol Pot, the essence of these wars has not changed in any way. It always begins with a cult of strength and belief in one's superiority, racial, class superiority, or ideological superiority over another human being, be it a person of another nationality from another country or sometimes from their own nation and own country. However, man always pitched himself against the aggressor and the genocider, a free man. Aggression stirs in people the will to resist, courage, fortitude, solidarity, and the desire to support the victims of injustice. And thus, we continue to exist as humanity. I think this is an obligation derived not only from the harsh laws of politics, it lies at the very foundation of human nature. For as Pericles put it in his famous Athenian funeral oration, happiness is the fruit of freedom and freedom of valor. A man and a nation is able to pay any price for freedom and fight for it till the very end. Man rebelled against slavery, colonialism, oppression. Man rebelled against it because it is his nature and it is his law, the inalienable law of every man to freedom and respect of his human dignity. For months now, Ukraine has been exemplifying to us almost unbelievable valor. Therefore, in conclusion, I call on all of you from this place, let us not be indifferent to the heroism and full determination of the struggle for freedom. Let us never show indifference to any nation that defends itself against tyranny and contempt for humanity. For by doing so, it always defends all of humanity against such tyranny and contempt. The vision of a world in which only naked and brutal power wins is not only wrong and immoral, but it can lead to a conflagration engulfing the entire world. I am convinced that on this occasion it is no different. And I say this in the forum of an organization that was formed in the wake of the greatest of such conflagrations after the Second World War. It is not without a reason that in 1945 the leaders of our countries, the founding members of the United Nations, declared their intent to build a world based on dialogue, opposing the use of naked and brutal force. Let us not forget this legacy. Let us not allow any tragedies to happen in the future similar to those the world experienced in the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Poland for the statement just made, and I request the protocol to escort His Excellency.